Não?
Já foi, Yara, estamos ao vivo.
Bem-vindas, bem-vindos, bem-vindes à mesa oficial de encerramento do terceiro Vozes, Mulheres na Filosofia, que por 3 semanas reuniu alunas de graduação, pesquisadoras em todos os estágios da carreira e professoras para discutir filosofia e para discutir o tema urgente das mulheres na filosofia. É claro que não estiveram presentes apenas mulheres, mas é característica do Vozes que aqui nós estamos em maioria. Eu agradeço a todos e todas os que estiveram com a gente nessa jornada de 2021, num momento tão difícil para o Brasil. O Vozes é uma realização da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, com o apoio da FAPERJ, essa terceira edição. Com a gente hoje, Lisa Shapiro vai apresentar a conferência Cânone, Gênero e Historiografia. Professora do Departamento de Filosofia da Simon Fraser University, doutora em Filosofia pela Universidade de Pittsburgh, atualmente, Lisa Shapiro é investigadora principal do projeto Extending New Narratives in the History of Philosophy, ou em português, estendendo as novas narrativas na história da filosofia, que envolve pesquisadoras e pesquisadoras de diversos países, incluindo o Brasil. Diretamente envolvida no Vozes, Nastassja, Pugliese, Gisele Seco, eu mesma, entre outras, fazemos parte da equipe de colaboradoras do Extending New Narratives. Recentemente, Lisa Shapiro editou o livro Pleasure, a History, pela Oxford University Press. Em 2012, também pela Oxford, o livro Emotions and Cognitive Life in Medieval and Early Modern Philosophy. Ainda essa noite, teremos com a gente a professora da Faculdade de Educação e do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Educação e também do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Lógica e Metafísica da UFRJ, Nastassja Pugliese, que vai integrar a mesa como comentadora. Ela me disse que eu não deveria apresentá-la, mas ninguém dispensa apresentação, ainda mais uma mulher filósofa. Então, eu quero lembrar que Nastassja Pugliese é doutora pela Universidade da Geórgia, pós-doutora pela USP, coordenadora do GT Mulheres na História da Filosofia, autora de diversos artigos e capítulos de livro, e ela acaba de publicar, recomendo fortemente, Saindo do Forno, Monism and Individuation in Anne Conway as a Critic of Spinoza, no livro Modern Philosophers from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. É a ela, a Nastassja, que nós devemos a maravilhosa organização do terceiro Vozes Mulheres na Filosofia. Nastassja, muitíssimo obrigada, parabéns por ter, nesse momento tão difícil, proporcionado para a gente esse encontro. Quero agradecer também a toda a equipe organizadora, a Laura Gerbasi, a Min Pontes, Carmel Ramos, Renata Augusto e Bernardo Oliveira. Pessoal, a Lisa vai fazer a conferência dela em inglês, a Nastassja vai comentar em português, e vocês podem fazer as perguntas tanto em inglês quanto em português, que a gente vai dar um jeito dessa comunicação acontecer. Lisa Shapiro, I was telling the audience that it's a great pleasure to be here today with you and Nastassja. This is the third edition of the Voices, Women in Philosophy, or Vozes, Mulheres na Filosofia, that brings together women thinking about philosophy and doing philosophy. Here, we are not a minority. In this very difficult time for Brazil, especially for Brazilian women, being here with all these people is a way to resist. Thank you for being here with us today. Lisa, you have the time you need.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very generous introduction, and also for the invitation. While it would have been an absolutely wonderful pleasure to join you in Brazil, it is a real pleasure to be able to take advantage of technology to be with you this evening. All right, so canon, gender, and historiography. If any period in the history of philosophy has a philosophical canon, it's the period from roughly 1580 to 1780, or what is often referred to as the early modern period. While the situation on the ground is rapidly shifting, it is still the norm within the English-speaking world for both the teaching and continuing scholarship of early modern philosophy to focus on 7 key figures: Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and Kant. These 7 figures constitute the early modern philosophical canon. For quite a number of years now, historians of philosophy have recognized that this canon excludes women. The remedy for this exclusion is my particular concern here. More recently, there's been a recognition that this is the European early modern philosophical canon. While I will not be able to address the fact that this canon is distinctly European or even Western European here, by reflecting upon this canon, I suspect we can learn something not only about the history of European philosophy, but also about philosophical canons more generally. What we learn may well help us in moving beyond this canon, but also prove instructive about the norms of historiography and of philosophy more generally. I begin by setting out tacit assumptions of a philosophical canon, and so reasons for calling those assumptions into question. One of those reasons is the way in which women were written out of the history of philosophy in the 19th century. In section 2, I turn to consider some remedies for that exclusion and the prospects for their success. I argue that to successfully redress the injustice of excluding women from European intellectual history, we need to recognize that while some women were interested in the questions that dominate our current history of philosophy, others were interested in different yet no less central questions. Moreover, for many women philosophers, no matter what questions moved them philosophically, philosophy was not an idle intellectual exercise, but rather addressed questions that were very much alive in the context in which they were writing. Recognizing their legitimacy as philosophers aligns with recent critiques of contemporary philosophy. I conclude by suggesting that our histories of philosophy would be more inclusive if we moved from a philosophical canon dominated by a very limited set of figures to one that was framed by a set of questions. We might call these questions timeless questions as they arise again and again, yet nonetheless we pose them in a particular place and historical context, and they move us to the reflection that constitutes the practice of philosophy. So, section 1, the uses and disadvantages of the European philosophical canon. Often when philosophers talk of our canon, we ignore the origins of the term. Per its primary definition, a canon is a rule of law decreed by the church, typically by a small subset of those in authority, for instance, the Pope or a council charged with developing the law. A canon in this sense is sacred. Also in a religious context, a canon can refer to a set of books identified by the church as having authenticity as divinely inspired. These works are canonized, and in at least some instances, the authors of those books are sainted. Others who are deemed as authentically having divine inspiration are also canonized and placed in the calendar of saints. This ecclesiastical sense of canon is then secularized to mean a law or rule, or a fundamental principle governing a body of knowledge, or more loosely, a standard of taste. Now, it might seem easy to take this etymological point cavalierly and claim that in the European philosophical tradition, our canon is secular and not tied to any authentic divine inspiration. However, this dismissal is not as easy as it might appear. The European early modern period, in particular, is marked by wars of religion and the effort to set up philosophy apart from theology. This might lead us to wonder whether the idea of a canon of early modern European philosophy is in fact designed to be a secular alternative to a philosophical tradition tied to theology. Second, and more importantly for my purposes, the key feature of an ecclesiastical canon is its authentic connection to the divine. Once it's established that an individual is divinely inspired, there can be no questioning of their privileged status, nor of the place of their words and works. Canonical religious figures and their works carry an unchallengeable authority in virtue of their connection to the divine, and insofar as their authority is unchallengeable, their views are taken as necessary truths. Secular philosophical canonical figures have come to carry a similar unchallengeable authority. Our early modern canonical philosophers derive their authority not through a particular connection to the divine, but rather from their connection to reason. These figures are deemed to be great minds. It is, however, unclear just what that means. It cannot be because they manage to decisively answer philosophical questions, for the very storyline that ties the canonical figures together depends on their having made errors. It cannot be because they are remarkably effective at conveying their philosophical views. Though some are great stylists, others could well have used an editor. Nonetheless, of course, they are taken to be great in part because they made an impact in their own day. Nonetheless, having had an impact guarantees neither greatness nor the enduring judgment of their greatness. At the very least, we take these canonical figures to have great minds because the answers they offer to a set of philosophical questions in metaphysics and epistemology inform discussions of the same questions that are still alive today. The ontology of substance and mode, of whether what exists are substances, and if so, the essences of those substances, the nature of causation, the nature of mental representation, and of how our ideas can enable us to have knowledge of things. These are good philosophical questions, but we take these questions to be agenda setting, as necessary to address. I want to suggest that we canonize a philosopher as a secular saint of philosophy insofar as we take them to offer answers that make progress in answering these questions understood to be necessary. Further, in being so canonized, even though their answers may be mistaken, their mistakes appear necessary for us to have made further progress and to get closer to definitive answers. While the early modern philosophical canon may seem to have an elevated status, the reality is that it's deeply contingent that we ended up with these 7 philosophers. For one, which philosophers count as canonical very much depends on the linguistic community in which one finds oneself. There are differences between the American, English, French, and German canonical program. Further, Bruce Kuklick has shown in the American context that the canonization of these 7 thinkers is in part a function of the late 19th century development of university textbooks and the related effort to develop a distinctively American philosophical program with all its associated internal politics. That is, it depends on, and this is a quote, it depends on disorder, on luck, on cultural transitions that, if not random, certainly do not reflect overriding purpose, on scholarly power plays, and on the sheer glacial inertia of the institutions of higher education. End quote. More recently, the work of Delphine Antoine Mahut and Sabrina Ebersmeyer demonstrate in detail that in other locales too, there are complex political considerations involved in establishing a philosophical canon in the first place. Antoine Mahut, in her forthcoming L'autorité d'un canon philosophique, Le cas de Descartes, aims to show that the role in which a canonical figure plays in a history of philosophy is something that shifts with interpretations that are highly sensitive to the context in which those interpretations are developed. In a certain respect, then, the very identity of a given canonical figure is contingent. In an article that anticipates the monograph, she provides a snapshot of how this works in Joseph-Marie Desgerando's shifting readings of Descartes in the 2 editions of his Histoire comparée des systèmes de philosophie, in 1804 and posthumously published 1847. Both histories of philosophy have in mind the role of philosophy in French education and the role that education was to play in the post-revolutionary French Republic. That vision of that role shifts from 1804 to 1847, and with it, so too does the way in which Descartes' philosophy is characterized. There is thus not a fact of the matter about the Descartes ensconced in the philosophical canon. As Antoine Mahut puts it, and this is a quote, writing the history of philosophy can, in general, be seen as comparable to a battle, one which opens up the possibility of broadening the canon to include more figures, but also for broadening the understanding of the canonical figures themselves, or pluralizing the canonical figures. While Antoine Mahut is concerned to demonstrate how our understanding of particular canonical figures is contingent on social and political aims, and so to pluralize them, Ebersmeyer, in her article From a Memorable Place to Drops in the Ocean, looks at the writing of German histories of philosophy in the 19th century to show just how, from generation to generation, women became more and more marginalized from the history of philosophy, until there were simply no women in it. What is at one and the same time unsurprising and remarkable are the justifications for the exclusion of women. One's work was derivative, another did not rise to the same level of greatness as the sainted few. Of still others, it was denied that they were even doing philosophy. Ebersmeyer highlights that these efforts intensified at just the moment where arguments were being leveled for women's suffrage and entitlement to attend university. And women's exclusion from the history of philosophy came to be naturalized, justified by the supposed, quote, natural inaptitude of women for philosophy, end quote, conveniently aligning with political efforts to quash women's right to political representation and to higher education. Section 2, the exclusion of women and strategies for inclusion. It's worth comparing contemporary canon-driven history of philosophy, albeit one that's changing quickly, with the histories of philosophy presented in the 17th and 18th centuries, for there were histories of philosophy that did include women. The Renaissance and early modern periods saw the reintroduction of Diogenes Laertius's Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, of which printed editions began to circulate in 1472, with a complete text published in 1533. The edition of 1692, edited by Marcus Meibomius, inaugurated the conventions still in use today. Not only does that work allude to the wives, daughters, and even mothers of eminent philosophers, as if they were involved in philosophy themselves, it also recounts a number of women philosophers, including Theano, Pythagoras' wife, Themistoclea, with whom Pythagoras studied, Damo, Pythagoras' daughter and student, and Hipparchia. Perhaps following the style of Diogenes, a number of women and men authors engaged in the Querelle des Femmes provided their own catalogs of women philosophers and intellectuals from across history to bolster their arguments that women are indeed fully rational and capable of real intellectual achievement. The list of names of strong, successful women leaders in Lucretia Marinella's On the Excellence and Nobility of Women and the Defects and Vices of Men in 1601, in Marie de Gournay's On the Equality of Men and Women in 1622, and later in Poulain de la Barre's On the Equality of the Two Sexes in 1673, not only support arguments for women's intellectual abilities, they are also effectively notes for histories of women philosophers. Perhaps for this reason, Thomas Stanley's History of Philosophy, published in 1655, included 24 women philosophers, and Gilles Ménage compiled 65 women in his History of Women Philosophers, published in 1690, an appendix to editions of both Diogenes Laertius and Plutarch. Other 17th century works by Jean de la Forge, 1663, and Marguerite Buffet, 1668, included both historical and contemporary women thinkers. This practice of including women in the histories of philosophy continued into the 18th century, not only through reeditions of Stanley, but also works like Mary Hayes's Female Biography in 1803. It's not until the 19th century that women start to be written out of the history of philosophy. As we work to reintroduce women into the history of philosophy, there are a number of strategies to take. One obvious step is to find the names of those who have gone missing from our intellectual history along with their works. We can go back to those histories of philosophy that do mention women and gather those names once again. Mary Ellen Waithe, in the 3 volumes of her History of Women Philosophers, brings to the fore 21 women philosophers in Greek and Roman antiquity, another 15 from the medieval and Renaissance periods, and 31 women from 1600 to 1900. The Catalogue of the Other Voice in Early Modern Europe series, which is edited by literary historians, includes a large number of women philosophers from the Renaissance, a period largely ignored by historians of philosophy. Eileen O'Neill, in her agenda-setting piece, Disappearing Ink, enumerates more than 55 women whose intellectual labor demands our attention, and that is only in one 200-year stretch. Of course, these resources may well also omit many names, so this is a bit of an archaeological project. As O'Neill recognizes, uncovering all these names also leaves us with a real practical problem. In order to truly recover these women thinkers, someone, hopefully more than one person, has to recover, read, and understand what's philosophically interesting about their works. This is a challenge for a number of reasons. First, there are only so many hours in a day, and there are a lot of works to be read. Moreover, identifying what is philosophically interesting in a work for which there is literally no body of scholarly literature is just difficult. It requires the reader to have an openness to the text that allows them to hear the philosophical issues it engages. We historians of philosophy are simply not accustomed to reading texts that are new to us, and doing so takes time, patience, and perhaps most importantly, the opportunity to receive feedback, which can be hard when others have not read the work under discussion. There are added hurdles. Women philosophers often wrote in genres that have fallen out of fashion, and they were interested in philosophical questions that became gendered and then downgraded, and in some cases have disappeared from philosophy. There are a number of ways to address this practical problem, being mindful of these challenges. I want to focus on 3. First, we can prioritize attending to women philosophers whose own philosophical work engages with and intersects that of canonical philosophers. This approach can work to some extent. Princess Elizabeth's extant philosophical work consists in her correspondence with Descartes. Damaris Cudworth Lady Masham corresponded with Leibniz in defense of her close friend Locke's philosophical program. Catherine Trotter Coburn also wrote in defense of Locke. Nonetheless, this strategy has at least 2 limitations. First, it inevitably positions women philosophers as subordinate to their canonical counterparts, for the women are read primarily as responding to the work of great thinkers, rather than putting forward ideas of their own. This limitation might be overcome by looking to women who did develop their own original philosophies as an alternative to those advanced by canonical figures. Margaret Cavendish, for instance, certainly aimed to do this in developing her natural philosophy. Her philosophical letters consist of an imagined correspondence between herself and Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, Henry Moore, and Jean-Baptiste von Helmont. And that work shows just how her own natural philosophy is developing in response to the shortcomings of those advanced by others. This philosophy reaches maturity in her Observations on the Experimental Philosophy, in which she advances a vitalist metaphysics that affords its own ontology, as well as accounts of causation, perception, and knowledge. Insofar as she's addressing the philosophical questions put on the agenda by the early modern philosophical canon, she can be brought into conversation with our 7 canonical figures relatively seamlessly. Similar strategies can be and are being deployed with other women of the period. For instance, Anne Conway's distinctive metaphysics can be put into conversation with Spinoza's, as Nastassja has done in her work. And Spinoza is, of course, in conversation with that of Descartes and Leibniz, and Émilie du Châtelet's natural philosophy and philosophy of science directly engages with that of Newton and Leibniz, and can also be set into conversation with Kant's philosophy. Second, this strategy, even while it does allow for restoring some women their places in the history of philosophy, selects for the philosophical agenda of the existing canon. These women are taken to be worth attending to because they are focused on central questions of metaphysics and epistemology. It's certainly true that these are important and even core philosophical questions, but the canonical narrative of early modern history of philosophy presumes that these are the most central questions of philosophy, those necessary to address, and pushes us, if not to exclude, then to ignore other important philosophical questions. The second strategy for addressing the practical problem effectively asks us to filter through the large number of women philosophers looking for greatness that has been missed, and greatness is understood as making contributions to the canonical philosophical agenda that have not been adequately recognized. I have concerns about this strategy. Most trenchantly, simply expanding the canon in this way leaves an exclusionary structure very much still in place. The appearance of the necessity of the philosophical agenda is left solidly in place, while a handful of women may well gain some recognition. There will be many who will continue to be neglected. It might end up being even worse. For although one might take the canonical philosophers to be great because they made progress on the most central philosophical questions, one might also take it that the philosophical questions become so central because the philosophical agenda, because those were the questions these canonical figures asked. That is, the canon might be substantively self-reinforcing. Once canonical figures get recognized as great, because they manage to make some progress in addressing some questions, perhaps, the importance and centrality of the questions in metaphysics and epistemology is validated by their being the focus of these great minds. And then greatness of their minds is further revealed in their framing and prioritizing these questions in metaphysics and epistemology, and so on. Reactionary forces might push back that while these women might have given particularly astute answers to these questions, they themselves were not the agenda setters. That would inevitably lead to diminishing the contribution of these women, and thus to them once again being moved to the shadows. However, we need not concede the standard of greatness that seems to drive the early modern European canon. In the introduction to What Makes a Philosopher Great, Stephen Hetherington suggests that philosophical greatness, rather than a property of an individual thinker, provides a window into what philosophy is like at its best. He suggests that great philosophy, or a great philosopher, might well be somewhat like great art or a great artist, reorienting us, enabling us to see both the world and ourselves in a new way. This suggestion reminds us that philosophy is a humanistic inquiry, which aims not simply to reveal truths about the world, but also in doing so to facilitate our understanding ourselves in that world. In keeping with these humanistic aims, a great philosopher does the work of jarring us to re-examine what we have been brought up to uncritically assume, and demonstrates how doing so makes a difference in the world in which we live. In that same volume, Karen Detlefsen argues that du Châtelet's greatness consists less in her contributions to metaphysics and philosophy of science, though those contributions were very significant, and more in the original ways in which du Châtelet engages with questions surrounding human minds, ownership of one's mind, and the role that education plays in such ownership. The precision with which she does so, and the concern that she holds to improve the lives of human beings, and in particular those who are more socially disadvantaged than others. For Detlefsen, du Châtelet's greatness is certainly tied to the original contributions she makes in philosophy and the lucidity of her writing, but is not separable from the social significance of those contributions. Detlefsen's interpretation of du Châtelet brings me to the third strategy for approaching the large number of early modern women who have been neglected. While philosophy of mind has long been counted among the canonical topics of early modern philosophy, the focus has largely been on mental representation and related epistemic questions. What is an idea? Does having an idea entail awareness of its content? What is the nature of awareness or consciousness? What is the connection between the content of the idea and its actual object in the world? Detlefsen, however, focuses on du Châtelet's attention to a different dimension of early modern accounts of mind, the ownership of one's thoughts. This ownership of thought is related to the canonical question of consciousness, but it adds texture to it. When we own our thoughts, we are not merely aware of them, but have appropriated them. While for Detlefsen, part of du Châtelet's originality is her shifting of a central question, Detlefsen situates du Châtelet within a discussion that had been going on long before her, one about equality of women as rational creatures, and so about the importance of educating women. So du Châtelet's greatness is not in her special insight or identification of a question. Detlefsen argues that du Châtelet is a great philosopher in that she rejects appeals to biblical and religious authority to ground rationality, and thereby sets self-ownership of thought on solid secular ground. And in doing so, she opens up the possibility of rejecting the social customs and structures that subjugate women in a new way, one that is not ultimately constrained by religious authority, even if she herself does not fully advocate for those changes. Du Châtelet thus helps to create the intellectual conditions that enable there to be more substantive equality between people, and so to more just societies. Essential to du Châtelet's philosophical greatness is her commitment to principles that make knowledge a good that is accessible to all, and her reconception of education such that through education, that good can be equitably distributed. Part of the reason contributions of women philosophers have been neglected or even erased is because the philosophical questions in which they are most interested were not and have not been on the canonical agenda. Du Châtelet is one of a long line of women thinkers who are particularly concerned with education, and women's education in particular, to argue that women are fit to be educated and so ought to be educated, and to consider the form that education ought to take. And yet, until very recently, these works were not read by historians of philosophy. There are other philosophical questions that historical women thinkers were interested in, and yet are not taken seriously within the history of philosophy. Some women were concerned to work out how there could be equality between individual human beings despite differences. For instance, the equality of the two sexes. Others were concerned to distinguish true friendship from the superficial relationships that sometimes pass for friends. Others were concerned with religion and distinguishing what was sometimes referred to as true religion from a feigned religious authority. Others considered the challenges the marital contract visited upon women under conditions of real inequality, and so raised questions about the nature of contracts more generally. These considerations of marriage were also often connected with evaluations of familial structures. More standard philosophical questions about the passions and their regulation, virtue and autonomy were also of interest to these historical women philosophers. O'Neill suggests that women whose philosophy is centered on these topics drop out of the history of philosophy because the questions themselves become gendered and diminish in value insofar as they are deemed feminine. While, as Ebersmeyer's work shows, this is undoubtedly the case, there is another dimension to the philosophical questions in which women thinkers have been historically interested. For these women, philosophy is a means of both coming to explicate and understand important aspects of the particular situations in which they find themselves, and providing direction for how to live in those situations. Two critiques of contemporary moral philosophy can help us understand how this intertwining of philosophical theorizing with the practical significance of that philosophy has also led to their historical exclusion. First, G.E.M. Anscombe, in her Modern Moral Philosophy, takes aim at the impoverished sense of moral in play in contemporary moral philosophy, and in particular the way in which the moral has become divorced from a good that, as Aristotle well recognized, is inseparable from human flourishing. Many women philosophers of the past developed their own philosophical views with human flourishing very much at the fore. They are less concerned with developing abstract theories that provide mechanisms for drawing distinctions of what is owed or desirable or permissible than with providing arguments for principles that both hold and must be implemented to improve human life. Their work thus does not fit easily into the dominant discussions of contemporary ethics. Second, contemporary philosopher Charles Mills draws a distinction between two approaches in ethics and political philosophy: ideal theory and non-ideal theory. Ideal theory privileges developing idealized descriptions, which are then deployed as models to the exclusion of considering actual cases. These idealized models are meant to help us articulate the norms of decision-making to which we ought to be committed. The classic example of a contemporary ideal theory is that articulated at the beginning of John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, in which we are asked to consider a group of individuals in an original position behind a veil of ignorance about where they are situated, behind a veil of ignorance about where they are situated in the world, and determine which principles they would all agree to. But ideal theory certainly predates Rawls. Through its privileging of idealized models in this way, ideal theory not only ends up abstracting away from the messiness of human life, but also from the contexts and situations that move us to ask questions about the human good and how it ought to guide decision-making and about a just society in the first place. Non-ideal theory, however, recognizes human agents in the complex situations they are in, replete with varieties of lived experience and in messy and inequitable social relations, and aims to articulate general principles and norms to guide human action and interaction that respect these complexities. Many historical women's approach to philosophy is akin to that of non-ideal theory. They are concerned to understand and address the particular challenges they confront as women within a social context that denigrates their intellectual capacities, mocks their social relationships, and gives them very limited options for structuring their own life path. Their philosophical efforts aim to articulate new conceptions of personhood that affirm their status as persons and of the equality between persons that puts them on level ground. to reflect on the purpose of education and articulate norms to guide educational practices and institutions, to articulate normative standards to shape social interactions, for instance, by distinguishing true friendship from the superficially friendly relationships, or by articulating the norms that ought to guide marriage and similar contractual agreements, to develop accounts of authentic faith and belief in God, as well as to develop accounts of the passions, virtue, and autonomy that both reflect and are responsive to social reality. Just as philosophy moved towards valorizing ideal theory, so too did the writing of the history of philosophy move toward excluding those who assumed non-ideal theoretic assumed a non-ideal theoretic approach. Moens Lerche argues that for Martial Guéroult, the very influential 20th century French historian of philosophy, philosophy ought to be defined as, quote, any systematic concern for atemporal truth. Lerche shows how this conception of philosophy, rooted in a Kantian transcendental project, arises out of a search for a principle through which points of commonality between the work of philosophers of the past and the work of contemporary philosophy can be recognized, even though the work of the two might look quite different. It is through this principle that, according to Guéroult, a history of philosophy can be written. Thus, Guéroult's own interpretive work aims to demonstrate the systematicity in philosophers like Descartes, Malebranche, and Spinoza. That it is hard to imagine how these thinkers might have been read in a way that wasn't as systematic shows just how deep Guéroult's influence has been and how it is in the present almost uncritically accepted. However, as innocuous as Guéroult's definition of philosophy might seem, he countenances any systematic effort to arrive at timeless truths. The privileging of systematicity and the pursuit of atemporal truth effectively excludes the intellectual work of women in the history of philosophy from being philosophical. Truly recovering the work of women philosophers of the past will involve recognizing that there are philosophical questions that are best addressed by attending to the context in which the questions arise, and looking for answers that take the form of a non-ideal theory that is embedded in those contexts. Insofar as philosophical engagement is sensitive to historical situation, we should also expect that what counts as a philosophical system might well look very different than what we are accustomed to. While we might continue to expect internal consistency and even the articulation of fundamental assumptions or principles, to be philosophical, a program need not aim to explain the totality of things. It need only aim to make sense of elements of lived experience that are of particular moment. So, section 3, lessons for the historiography of philosophy. This is the concluding section. I have been focused on criticizing the early modern European philosophical canon, and so canons in general. But it should also be noted that there are some advantages to having a canon. The early modern philosophical canon, insofar as it sets an agenda of philosophical questions, provides a background to contemporary philosophical discussions and helps to connect the philosophical present with the philosophical past. This connection helps to justify contemporary philosophical interests. It has also afforded philosophers with different specialized interests to share a background in common, making it easier to have a broader philosophical community. In teaching, a canon helps in structuring curriculum, and so affords a degree of continuity from one institution to another. We aim to disrupt the canon because it is exclusionary. Can we retain these advantages even while we work to make the history of philosophy more inclusive? Noting these advantages can help provide additional guidance as we set about reconceiving both the history of philosophy and how we write this new history. of it. First, while undertaking the doxographic labor to retrieve the work of the many women philosophers is essential, we need to be mindful that the doxography not be simply for doxography's sake. That is, the philosopher's project is not identical to a philologist's. In doing this philosophical archaeology, we need to look not only for artifacts, but also for points of potential commonality that can help to lend a degree of cohesion to our discipline. Second, while we like to think of the early modern canon as providing students and even more mature philosophers with a set of common texts that bind us all together, it is less the authors and their works that allow us to enter into conversation with one another, but rather the common interest in the philosophical questions that structure the canonical agenda. We are gripped by the questions that are front and center in the early modern canon, and through our interest in getting clear about the nature of things and about how we know things, we are primed to engage with one another, and in many cases, in quite animated ways. This grip the questions have on us is what some people described as a philosophical instinct, or a motivation to understand ourselves and our place in the world, to reflect on the world around us and our place in it. While we might well have a shared interest in canonical questions of metaphysics and epistemology, we do so because we have a shared inclination to ask philosophical questions in the first place, to take up a reflective stance. Indeed, philosophy matters precisely because of the reflective stance it cultivates. Philosophy asks us to identify assumptions, evaluate those assumptions, look for consistency and pressure points. The idea is that doing this actually helps to improve our lives. Notably, that is what these historical women philosophers think. Women thinkers in the history of philosophy are interested in philosophical questions because they believe that articulating our fundamental assumptions and getting them right can make a real difference in the quality of their lives, but also those of women, both their contemporaries and of the future. As we rewrite the history of philosophy, we ought to ensure that this reflective spirit is front and center, for it is through our shared interest in asking questions and interacting with one another to seek to answer them that we can find the commonality the canon provides rather than through a limited set of figures and texts. We might be tempted to characterize these as timeless questions, for they arise again and again. And insofar as they are philosophical, we engage with them intellectually and abstract from the context in which they arise. Nonetheless, while the questions pique our natural human curiosity, interest in them is sustained through a resonance in the context in which they arise. To sustain the presence of women and indeed other neglected figures in the history of philosophy, we need to find a way to write histories of non-ideal philosophies. Doing so will involve reflecting on and making explicit our own interests and aims in undertaking the history of philosophy itself. The failure to do just that is what has left us with a small set of canonized philosophical saints. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for the wonderful talk. Now, Nastassja, the word is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, for the exciting talk, and thank you for bringing to our conference this topic that we have been studying so carefully since the very first edition of the Voices conference in 2017. And if you excuse me, I'll take some time to address the public now. I'll make a brief summary of your trajectory and of the paper so we can all be on the same page for the Q&A. And after that, I will open the debate with a question for you. Boa noite, pessoal. Eu queria primeiro agradecer novamente a Lisa por ter aceitado estar aqui com a gente hoje, por ter apoiado com o Extending New Narratives, a produção do terceiro Vozes, Mulheres na História da Filosofia, e por nos dar a oportunidade de publicar a tradução do texto da apresentação dela de hoje, um texto inédito, no volume que iremos produzir dessa edição do Vozes. O texto dela foi traduzido pela Renata Augusto, do PPGLM da UFRJ, para o português, e conta com uma revisão da Laura Gerbasi, do PPGE da UFRJ, e esse texto está sendo traduzido sob a minha supervisão. Fiquem ligados que a gente vai avisar quando o volume sair. Eu queria explicar brevemente o meu papel de comentarista hoje. Meu papel aqui é meramente pedagógico, já que não temos tradução simultânea da fala da Lisa, eu vou resumir rapidamente o percurso que ela fez hoje, retomando a trajetória dela no tema, para garantir que estamos todos na mesma página para a hora do debate. Como essa fala vai ser legendada para o português posteriormente, eu não tomarei mais de 15 minutos fazendo isso, eu vou ser bem breve. É importante pontuar que o projeto Extending New Narratives é a continuação de um outro projeto que já foi finalizado entre 2015 e 2019, também dirigido pela Lisa Shapiro. Esse projeto tinha como objetivo desenvolver novas narrativas sobre o nosso passado filosófico, incluindo e tomando as mulheres filósofas como protagonistas da história da filosofia. O projeto tinha como foco o início da filosofia moderna, o período que eles consideraram sendo entre 1560 e 1810. Agora, o Extending New Narratives é um projeto que procura resgatar as obras de mulheres filósofas, né, e indivíduos de grupos que ficaram à margem da história da filosofia, procurando estabelecer estratégias para sustentar a presença, ou seja, mantê-los na história da filosofia. Esse percurso dos projetos se expressam em 3 textos da professora Shapiro, 2 que consolidam a proposta das novas narrativas, voltadas para o cânone filosófico do começo da modernidade, e agora esse que acabamos de ouvir, que apresenta a proposta metodológica da expansão e consolidação das novas narrativas. O primeiro artigo, então, dela, sobre esse tema, data de 2004. Ele é chamado Algumas Reflexões sobre o Lugar das Mulheres na Filosofia do Início da Modernidade. Some Thoughts on the Place of Women in Early Modern Philosophy, publicado na coletânea Feminist Reflections on the History of Philosophy, editada por Lily Allanen e Charlotte Witt. Aliás, vale chamar atenção também para a entrada que ela escreveu com a Charlotte Witt para a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, que se chama Feminist History of Philosophy. Bom, nesse artigo de 2004, a Shapiro coloca a questão da ausência das mulheres filósofas nas grandes antologias, afirmando que ela toma como não controverso o ponto de vista feminista que afirma que a ausência de mulheres na história, de que a filosofia conta, a ausência de mulheres na história que a filosofia conta a respeito de si mesma, é um fator problemático. E que o pressuposto, do seu paper vai ser de que esse é um problema que precisa ser remediado, Então, ela considera os modos de situar ou de ressituar as mulheres pensadoras na história da filosofia, levando em consideração estratégias que façam sentido também para aqueles que consideram o fato da ausência motivo de controvérsia. O texto mostra como esse período da história é especialmente fértil para a realização desse projeto de contar a história das mulheres na filosofia. Ela trata principalmente de 2 estratégias. A primeira seria de costurar os escritos de mulheres como Cavendish e Elizabeth de Boêmia nas narrativas já existentes. Narrativas estruturadas, eu estou citando ela, narrativas que são estruturadas na noção de progresso em torno de questões de metafísica, da filosofia da mente e de epistemologia. Fim da citação. Ela argumenta que essa estratégia não se sustenta por muito tempo, porque não fica claro como esses escritos podem se manter de modo estável no cânone. E também não nos ajudaria a argumentar com a estratégia de gênero, porque não é suficiente para justificar por que incluir mulheres e não outras figuras não centrais. E aí depois ela argumenta que a gente poderia costurar os escritos de mulheres a partir de outras perguntas filosóficas, perguntas que usualmente não são tomadas como centrais, como, por exemplo, a questão da racionalidade feminina, a natureza do feminino ou a questão da educação das mulheres. Essa distinção traria o argumento das motivações externas e as motivações internas ao cânone, o que a Lisa, no final do artigo, também considera como uma estratégia problemática. O artigo termina com ela sugerindo que o modelo da prática filosófica deve ser algo como uma conversa, que cada um traz para a mesa, na qual cada um traz para a mesa os seus pontos de vista a partir de suas vivências ou posições particulares. E aí, então, ela termina esse artigo de 2004 com a ideia de um cânone como uma conversa e autores e autoras como interlocutores. Ela retoma esse tema no artigo que a gente viu hoje, né? Por isso que eu achei importante ir para a origem, que é esse artigo de 2004. Aí depois, em 2016, ela retoma o artigo de 2004 e escreve um outro chamado Revisitando o Cânone Filosófico do Início da Modernidade, que é Revisiting the Early Modern Philosophical Canon, publicado pelo Journal of the American Philosophical Association. Nesse artigo, ela desenvolve a ideia de narrativa, né? Ela conceitua propriamente o cânone como uma narrativa, e ela distingue 3 elementos que são importantes de se tomar quando a gente fala de cânone filosófico. Uma história causal, um conjunto de questões filosóficas centrais e um conjunto de obras claramente filosóficas. E ela argumenta, a partir da análise do exemplo de como a história da filosofia pode ser contextualizada no interior da história da ciência, né? Ela faz uma abordagem interdisciplinar, e como essa estratégia nos permite modificar sutilmente as questões consideradas como centrais e permitir a inclusão de outras ou novas figuras no cânone. Isso também permitiria a inclusão de outros gêneros de escrita que poderiam também ser considerados filosóficos, como cartas, diários de viagens e outros. Ela termina esse texto chamando a atenção para uma questão que me é particularmente interessante, né? Que é a importância da relação entre cânone e currículo, que nesse texto ela fala especificamente enquanto a relação entre cânone e ensino, né? Ela considera que, apesar do cânone ser um modo de construção de um vocabulário comum entre estudantes e pesquisadores da filosofia, é importante levar para a sala de aula a problematização sobre as questões que tomamos como centrais, para que a interlocução com os nossos estudantes nos ajude a manter o vigor da prática filosófica. Também é um tema que ela, não a questão do ensino, mas a questão do currículo e o fato do cânone permitir a construção de um vocabulário comum, né, filosófico comum. Bom, e agora, então, hoje a gente viu esse texto inédito, né, intitulado Cânone, Gênero e Historiografia, no qual a professora Shapiro elabora sobre a questão do cânone, já partindo do reconhecimento das mudanças que a disciplina tem visto no tratamento do problema no que diz respeito à inclusão das mulheres. Ela argumenta, então, que as histórias da filosofia seriam mais inclusivas se passássemos, e aí eu cito a tradução da Renata, um cânone filosófico dominado por um conjunto muito limitado de figuras para um que fosse emoldurado por um conjunto de questões, e considera que essas questões podem ser chamadas de questões atemporais, já que surgem reiteradamente, ainda que as situemos em um determinado lugar e contexto históricos. Fim de citação. Essas questões são atemporais e, mais importante, elas nos movem para a reflexão do que constitui a prática da filosofia. O texto da Lisa Shapiro tem 3 partes. Na primeira, ela fala dos usos e das desvantagens do cânone filosófico europeu. Ela qualifica o cânone como cânone europeu e apresenta a definição primária de cânone como, eu cito a tradução, cânone é uma regra ou lei decretada pela Igreja, usualmente por um pequeno subconjunto de autoridades, por exemplo, o Papa ou um conselho encarregado de desenvolver a lei, fecha aspas, né? Que é, nesse sentido, sagrado, né? Para dizer que as figuras centrais do cânone são por nós tratadas como santos, né? Que carregam uma autoridade incontestável. Ela contrasta esse uso e esse lugar dos autores centrais com o fato de que o cânone é profundamente contingente. E dependendo, portanto, da comunidade linguística onde ele se insere, ela fala de cânone norte-americano, cânone alemão, cânone francês, então é profundamente contingente porque ele depende de uma comunidade linguística, ele depende de projetos curriculares e editoriais, né? Ele depende de políticas de publicação de livro, né? Fazendo referência à história material das ideias, né? E usando o exemplo do Descartes, ela afirma que mesmo a nossa compreensão sobre as figuras canônicas é contingente e muda com o tempo. Eu acho esse ponto muito importante. Ela pergunta quem foi Descartes, né? Mesmo a nossa compreensão de quem foram esses santos é contingente. Na segunda parte do texto, ela fala sobre a exclusão das mulheres e as estratégias para a inclusão. Ela começa essa parte chamando atenção para a diferença entre história da filosofia, que é orientada pelo cânone, feita nos dias atuais, e as histórias da filosofia apresentadas nos séculos 17 e 18, que incluíam mulheres. Então, ela chama atenção para esse fato de que, no passado, havia histórias da filosofia que incluíam mulheres. E aí ela cita Diógenes Laércio, ela cita diversos, o que a gente chama de catálogos de mulheres, né? E eu vou ser agora muito injusta com o meu resumo, porque ela falou de muitas coisas, fez uma análise muito interessante do nosso passado filosófico e da importância desse resgate para a nossa própria prática filosófica, e agora eu vou fazer um resumo relâmpago do final do texto para abrir, então, para as nossas perguntas, né? Então, ela fala, né, chamando atenção para a diferença que existe entre a história da filosofia orientada pelo cânone que a gente faz nos dias de hoje e as histórias da filosofia do século 17 e 18, que incluíam mulheres, e começa, ela começa daí, né, afirmando que havia histórias da filosofia que incluíam mulheres. Depois ela pensa sobre os limites da estratégia de inclusão das obras escritas por mulheres a partir do diálogo que elas tecem com os autores canônicos e as contribuições que elas fazem às questões centrais, o tema que apareceu lá no artigo de 2004. Então, ela argumenta sobre os limites de reestruturar o cânone a partir das questões que seriam propriamente femininas, né? Uma estratégia que ela considera como problemática na medida em que as questões passam a ser associadas ao gênero e perdem valor por causa disso. E aí, acho que essa é a contribuição mais importante desse artigo agora, né, de 2021, que a gente acabou de ouvir, é o uso que ela faz da distinção do Charles Mills no livro The Racial Contract, de 1997. O Charles Mills estabelece uma distinção entre duas abordagens na ética e na filosofia política, né? Ele fala da teoria ideal e da teoria não ideal. A teoria ideal seria aquela que privilegia o desenvolvimento de descrições idealizadas. Aí eu vou citar, né, a tradução da Renata do texto da Lisa. Privilegia o desenvolvimento de descrições idealizadas, que são, então, implantadas como modelos, excluindo a consideração acerca de casos reais. Esses modelos idealizados têm como objetivo nos auxiliar a articular as normas de tomada de decisão com as quais devemos estar comprometidos. Já a teoria não ideal reconhece os agentes humanos nas situações completas em que eles se inserem, repletos de variedades de experiências vividas e em relações sociais confusas e injustas, e visa articular princípios e normas gerais para orientar a ação e interação humanas que respeitem essas complexidades, né? Então, a gente teria uma teoria ideal que não leva em conta o sujeito situado e a teoria não ideal que leva em conta o sujeito situado e procura fazer uso da teoria para interferir na realidade social, né? Respeitar e orientar a ação no contexto histórico, né? Ela traz esse par conceitual para dizer que a abordagem da filosofia de muitas mulheres históricas se assemelha àquela da teoria não ideal. Ou seja, elas estão preocupadas em compreender e tratar dos desafios específicos que elas enfrentam como mulheres em um contexto social que desabona suas capacidades intelectuais, essa é a citação da tradução, desabona suas capacidades intelectuais, ridiculariza suas relações sociais e lhes oferece opções muito limitadas para estruturar o rumo de suas próprias vidas, né? E aí eu cito também agora uma parte da tradução. Assim como a filosofia avançou para a valorização da teoria ideal, também a produção da história da filosofia avançou no sentido de excluir aqueles que assumiam uma abordagem teórica não ideal, como um processo de constante abstração, né, e desengajamento da filosofia, né, desconexão da filosofia e da sua história com as questões práticas, né. Continua a citação. Tendo em vista que o engajamento filosófico é sensível à circunstância histórica, devemos também esperar que o que é considerado um sistema filosófico possa parecer muito diferente daquilo que estamos acostumados. Fecha a citação. Finalmente, a Lisa Shapiro termina com algumas lições para a historiografia da filosofia, depois de uma crítica ao cânone filosófico europeu do início da modernidade e a ideia de cânone em geral. Também leio a tradução da conclusão. Ela diz: ao reescrevermos a história da filosofia, devemos garantir que esse espírito reflexivo esteja à frente, pois é por meio de nosso interesse comum em fazer perguntas e interagir uns com os outros para buscar respostas a elas, que podemos encontrar aquilo que o cânone fornece como sendo comum, em vez de um conjunto limitado de figuras e textos. Para sustentar a presença de mulheres, e na verdade de outras figuras negligenciadas na história da filosofia, precisamos encontrar uma maneira de escrever histórias de filosofias não ideais. Fazer isso envolverá refletir e tornar explícitos os nossos próprios interesses e objetivos ao nos ocuparmos com a história da filosofia ela mesma. Fim de citação. Bom, esse foi o meu resumo pedagógico da trajetória da Lisa e do texto que ela apresentou hoje. E aí, assim, eu acho que, como comentadora, eu queria terminar com uma questão para a Lisa, que também se coloca para a gente quando a gente fala em história da filosofia brasileira e cânone filosófico europeu. E aí eu queria retomar uma pergunta que apareceu na segunda-feira, né, e que juntou um comentário meu e da Carla Rodrigues, que é a seguinte, assim: existe um caráter paradoxal nos projetos de reparação e construção narrativa quando a gente pensa a partir da chave de gênero, que é a ideia de que quando falamos em inclusão no cânone, a gente já pressupõe a exclusão e a presença de uma diferença determinante entre quem está no cânone e quem não está. Lisa agora traz a questão geográfica geopolítica para a discussão, né? E aí eu faço a mesma pergunta, só que mudando os termos, né? Quais as possibilidades e os limites da chave de interpretação geográfica? Quando a gente fala em cânone europeu como teoria ideal e obras de figuras não centrais como equivalentes a uma teoria não ideal, a gente não estaria reforçando uma diferença, né, que seria, sei lá, limitante de uma integração ou de uma história da filosofia mais plural? E aí aqui eu vou fazer uma pergunta, acho que é um pouco injusta, né? Eu fico me perguntando se essa visão não abriria espaço para um projeto nacionalista de cânone, né? Os europeus e o seu cânone europeu e os outros com um cânone outro. E, assim, poderia acabar reforçando as dinâmicas de poder, né, da política internacional, que já exclui e estigmatiza. Bom, é isso, essa é a minha contribuição. Eu vou repetir agora a minha questão para a Lisa em inglês e vou passar a bola para a Yara para conduzir o nosso debate. So, Lisa, my question for you is the following. I am sort of making an analogy between the paradoxes of inclusion of women on the traditional canon, right? Paradox, because if you want to include it, this idea presupposes that they are already excluded and that there is a determinate difference between what they do and what the canon is. So I'm making an analogy between this paradox, using gender as a category, and now evaluating your new contribution of taking geography as a category of historical political analysis, because you're talking in terms of European canon. So when we talk about the European canon and now I want you to tell me that whether what I'm understanding is wrong or not. So it seems that what you're doing is talking about the European canon as the ideal theory, and the work of non-central figures as non-ideal theories. So I am worried about this strategy, this geographical strategy, sort of opening space for nationalist defenses of the canon that can kind of reinforce a certain division of labor that is present in international politics. So instead of including, it sort of excludes and stigmatizes. I know that this is not your intention, definitely, but I wonder what are the limits and possibilities of taking geography as an interpretation key. And thank you again for your work. It was amazing.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that, but also thank you for your question. I have to say, that's the first time. So there's an interesting, so the focus on geography, on the European canon, has come recently to call the European canon, to recognize the canon as in fact a European canon, has come relatively recently, insofar as there's a kind of silent assumption that more and more scholars, with the era of economic globalization, there's been more of a recognition of global philosophical traditions. So Chinese philosophy, Korean philosophy, Japanese philosophy, Indian philosophy, African philosophy, and Latin American philosophy, obviously, as well. And so to identify the philosophical canon as simply the canon simpliciter, I think certain has a suggestion of just affirming colonialism, right, in a sense, that there's this kind of intellectual colonization of intellectual history by assimilating what is in fact European intellectual history with intellectual history, a universal intellectual history, and thereby denying, effectively erasing the intellectual work of other intellectual historical traditions globally. So your question is actually going the other direction and anticipating a backlash, as it were, to that kind of recognition of the hegemony of the European intellectual historical context to generate a kind of affirmation of a potential move to affirm that superiority. And that possibility, quite frankly, hadn't really occurred to me until your question. When there's criticism, there's always a backlash. So I take your point. I do take your point. I don't know what. So I guess what I would want to say is we have to find a way of both recognizing the fact that this intellectual history is unique. It's emerging from a particular geographic region, Europe, Western Europe in particular. It's written at a time, where there is colonization, or the figures are writing during a time when there is colonization globally. Although the history is written in the 19th century as empires begin to move out of their former colonies. I do think, I'm not an intellectual historian. I'm just a historian of philosophy. And I do think one thing that I would be really interested to read, and I don't know that it has been written, is an intellectual history that ties the writing of the standard histories of philosophy to the loss of power with revolutionary, with the forces that lead towards decolonization. I think so. For instance, Antoine Mahut's work ties the initial writing of French history of philosophy, and in particular the place of Descartes in that history of philosophy, is tied to the development of the French national curriculum post-revolutionary, in the Napoleonic era, after the revolution, as France is becoming a different kind of country. So that standard curriculum, that the histories of philosophy as they come to be written, it's serving to create national identities, right? And to then entrench, and as the canon gets entrenched, those national identities do get entrenched. I'm interested in how writing an intellectual history gets aligned with creating a national identity. So I don't have answers. I think you're just raising a really interesting question, right? So it would, to challenge the canon would be challenging the creation of those national identities, which can be very threatening to people, and so lead to a backlash. So your question makes, I think, good sense, and we should do more to anticipate it. I do think at the same time, we don't need to just accept it as a fait accompli, right? We can think about how to recognize the geographic particularity without becoming a nationalist, right? In demeanor, right? That you can have both, right? I don't think there's anything wrong with recognizing that this is a Western European canon, and it's tied to the history that those of us living in countries that see Western Europe as part of our history. It's part of our intellectual heritage. But so are other, other figures that aren't well studied, and why not look to them? That's a great question. I hope that does something to answer it.
Yes, I think there are a lot of ways to tackle this difficult problem. So I don't want to talk about that right now with you, because I think there are other people who want to ask questions. So I'll just pass to Yara, and but yeah, thank you. I think we should think in terms of global history of philosophy. You're right. And perhaps see how the European canon and other canons come together in shaping national identities of colonized countries. And us, the colonized, should think of our national identities in terms of some sort of having the other within and figuring out a way to become ourselves. So this is a very important question for us. Yes.
Yeah, but I also think, one of the really helpful things of doing global history of philosophy is recognizing that across very different cultures, there is at least intertranslatability of philosophical questions that come up again and again, whether they're questions about what exists really, how do we have knowledge, or what the nature of virtue is, right? Who am I? What makes me the person I am? Across traditions, these are questions that come up, and that's what makes it all philosophy. They come up in different time periods and different societies, and so get expressed differently, but we can have conversations with one another, no matter where we're coming from, which is kind of cool, really, if you think about it.
Yes. Thank you. Yara, please.
Thank you, Lisa. Do you mind if I ask 2 questions and then 2 more?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So
I will take notes
from the audience is Viviane Rodegheri asks, once I heard from a professor that if the feminist philosophers want to do philosophy, they just need to do so. I think sometimes there is an image that feminist philosophy, continue, develops sociological questions and not philosophy at all. What would you say to these people from whom feminist philosophy is not sufficient as a genuine philosophy? The first question. The second, Ulisses Pinheiro asks, you mentioned diaries and letters as possible sources for studies of women's thought. How do you see the possibility of recognizing women's philosophical thoughts in literature?
Excellent questions, both of them. So let me start with the first question. Not an unfamiliar question to anyone, really. How is feminist philosophy isn't genuine philosophy? It's philosophy light, or it's perhaps belongs in another discipline, say sociology. And here, I think, what's the best way to respond to that? Well, I think I have a number of responses, and that's, I think, first, I don't think the question should be heard as a need to defend feminist philosophy. Rather, it should be turned around to ask what constitutes genuine philosophy versus non-genuine philosophy. And that's a really hard question to answer. My guess is most people, when faced with that question, will give the kind of response that Socrates' interlocutors often give. They'll just list examples of what counts as genuine philosophy without having anything that brings them, any definition that brings them all together. And one might then draw upon Socrates' methods to ask such a person to define things more, to define what they mean by genuine philosophy more clearly and not simply by example. The second thing I guess I would want to say is, look, there are lots of different disciplines that have feminist approaches to them. So a sociologist might be more interested in describing power structures, or doing some actual empirical work and tracking equity through actual metrics, developing metrics to track equity. That's not I think that's not philosophical work to engage in those methods. Philosophy has its own methods, so we try to clarify the concepts that are underpinning the use of that are underpinning the activities of others. So a feminist philosophy is going to be interested in feminism in different ways, right? So some feminist philosophers might be interested in the ways in which one's position in the world affects one's claims to knowledge. Well, then you're asking epistemological questions. Another might be interested in equity, right? What is equality? How ought we to define equality? Very few people will want to claim that equality consists in identity across individuals. Most of us want to acknowledge that there's we're all different individuals in different perspectives and with different positions in life. And the challenge of equity and equality is to think about how to understand how you can have a standard that allows for some kind of equality, even while recognizing the differentiation amongst individuals. That's a philosophical question. That's trying to understand the concept of equality. And so, those are some strategies for addressing that kind of challenge to feminist philosophy is just to turn the question around. What do you mean by genuine philosophy? And how is what the questions that I'm interested in as a feminist, how are those not genuine philosophical questions? So that's, takes a lot of inner peace and calm to be able to take up that Socratic road, I guess. With respect to the second question regarding the different genres of doing philosophy, I think this is a really interesting and fun question. I think so. From my point of view, I do think philosophy is done in a lot of different genres. In letters and in diaries, for instance, you might see arguments sketched out in a way that could have been in print. So they're discursive in the way a treatise has a discursive argument in it. But there are other ways of doing philosophy that are in different genres, like in poems or in novels, or dare I say, in meditations, in plays. And there, I think one of the questions ought to be, why that genre? What does the form of writing bring to the discussion? So why would someone, we have to learn how to read these works in different genres to extract the philosophical point. But at the same time, we also have to think about the relationship between form and content. One example, just to sort of not talk too much in the abstract, I did some work recently to try to understand one single poem of Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a Nova Hispanic philosopher of the 17th century. She did most of her philosophical work in poetry, though not all of it. Some of the poems are clearly philosophical. Right, they're skeptical arguments worked out in a poetic form, and you can ask, well, why is she writing poems rather than a skeptical argument? What's the point of having them be in poetry form? And there's some way you can answer that question by saying, well, she was a nun and this was a form of writing that was available to her. And that's to divorce the form from the content. But I don't think that's the best answer. I mean, it's hard to know. But one of her points in the poem that I was looking at was that we come to that the search for knowledge is one that involves emotions and desires, and in pursuing knowledge, we have to learn how to regulate those passions and those desires to not overreach, to not overextend our cognitive abilities, and to not overly discount our cognitive abilities. And so what I ended up thinking was that her choice of the poetic form was precisely to model that affective dimension of knowledge, because poems, one of the things poetry is supposed to do is be evocative of emotions. And so the poem's designed to take the reader through the emotional roller coaster of the pursuit of knowledge that she's describing. So yeah, I definitely think that women's philosophical thoughts are in literature, but we have to do a lot of work to really explain how that works, right? To do the interpretive work, to see it. Another example is George Eliot, who wrote lots of novels, but who also translated Spinoza into English, and Spinoza's Ethics into English. And I don't think it's unreasonable to see her interest in Spinoza as being brought to bear. I think she's got letters in which she actually says she thinks the novels are the best way to express what Spinoza's getting at. So sometimes you have clear a clearly self-aware novelist explaining what the philosophical content of the novel is supposed to be. And then you've got to do the work to see whether it's actually there. Thank you for the questions. There's more though, right?
Yes. We have two more, okay?
Excellent,
So,
excellent.
Thank you, Lisa. Gisele Sequas. Good to see you, Lisa. Thanks for the talk. I would like to know if you agree with the idea that sometimes works that recover women's philosophy also use ideal models, but in a different sense, in trying to avoid the paradox that Nastassja mentioned. They propose that other methods should be used to read women. In my view, this reinserts essentialism into the conversation. Would you agree that this is an ideal model in reverse? Women did not write like the canonical figures. They write like women. And this is all we need method, a new concept of philosophy, more literally, etc.
Gotcha. Okay. Do you want to read the second one before I answer this? Or? Okay.
Yes. Now, Rafaela Vaccari. Professor Shapiro, do you think that the recovery of other figures in philosophy, such as Black philosophers or other people we possibly don't know yet, implies a different methodology, or at least other elements that the one used for recovery of women philosophers? Thank you for your talk.
Great. Okay, so thank you both for those questions. Hi, Gisele. It's good to hear your question. I think there are some people who, in their work to recover women philosophers, make claims that that women write like women, but I don't think I would want to, and sort of seem to import a kind of essentialism there. But I don't think I would want to say that, or at least I hope I'm not saying that. I think what I want to say is something more that, look, socio-historical conditions, including the lack of formal education for women, the lack of, for instance, the lack of their being allowed to attend universities or university lectures, just opened up different kinds of opportunities for them to do philosophical work. So maybe if women had been able to go to university, they would have written treatises in a more standard format, but they weren't. And that didn't mean they didn't engage in any intellectual activity. They actually had lots of intellectual activity. And their modes that were available for them to express themselves were just different ones. So different forms of writing were acceptable, came to be acceptable for women. Novels for sure, poems for sure, but also polemics, interestingly. There are correspondence, published, strange genres that are an exchange of letters with men that are stylized in a way and then made public. So in that context, both the man and the woman are writing in the same genre and in the same way. So I don't think we need to have recourse to a kind of essentialism to explain the intellectual work products of women. It's sufficient just to point to the contingencies of socio-historical context and the kinds of writing that was prevalent, the kinds of writing that it was possible for women to do without too much effort, without too much of a struggle. I do think in the 19th century, maybe, that there is a kind of tendency to, because there were many more women writers as time goes on, there is a tendency to pigeonhole women as doing feminine style writing. But I think what the historical record also shows that lots and lots of women were doing writing polemics and kind of public argumentation around social issues. I'm thinking of in America, in the United States, the women involved in the abolitionist movement, both freed slaves and white women, publishing opinion pieces in newspapers that are very philosophically sophisticated, and that's, you know, that's a genre of writing that doesn't seem particularly gender specific. So thank you for your question. The next question around Black philosophers of the past and perhaps others, will they require different methodologies? That's an amazingly interesting question. One that I'm actually, there are a number of yeah, so the answer is yes, but I think once we start opening our minds to the expansiveness of what, you know, the human instinct of practicing philosophy, we need to acknowledge that there are many, many people who are undertaking philosophical reflection, and what we need to think about is how to appreciate that, right? How to recognize it for what it is without importing our own, you know, background philosophical concepts. So I think there are really, you know, the questions that come up are not unlike questions that anthropologists ask when they go into, you know, a setting where they have to really think carefully about the interpretive assumptions that they bring to bear on their observations. So I'm becoming more interested in indigenous. So here's an example: indigenous philosophy of indigenous peoples, where so much of indigenous traditions, no matter where you are, it's an oral tradition rather than a written tradition, and there are questions about, you know, how to understand the mode of explanation. So to take the Canadian Indigenous context, there's many Canadian Indigenous peoples, First Nations, but there's a general agreement that the knowledge of a people is passed on through storytelling, through oral storytelling. And then you have to think about, well, what, you know, how do we understand the content of that knowledge, the content of those stories that is respectful of those traditions and their particular mode of transmitting their knowledge. It's important to work with Indigenous peoples to not have a distorting effect of their traditional knowledges. There's all, and so that is a particular example that does raise all kinds of really interesting methodological questions that I think need to be taken slowly and work through, you know, and just work through thoughtfully and with care. So thank you for that question. I think it's absolutely, we need to be very attentive to the context of the philosophy that we're trying to recover.
Thank you, Lisa. So I would like to ask you the last question. I'm sorry if you don't mind.
No, please.
Very brief question. Do you think that the exclusion of women from the history of philosophy in the 19th century is related to the political question of women's voting rights? My question is, do you think that denial of women's capacity for philosophy, or the denial of women's reason, is a kind of reactionary reaction to the entry of women into the public sphere?
So Sabrina Ebersmeyer, in her article, suggests that that's the case in German history of philosophy, that there is a timing, an alignment of the timing of the fight for women's voting rights and the system. The article is really amazing. She goes through a series of histories of philosophy in the German tradition. And the first one, the second one's written by a student of the first one, and the third one's written by a student of the second one. And from generation to generation, she shows how women are downgraded and then totally written out of the histories. And at the same time, this is contemporaneous with the battle for women's suffrage. So I think that's the work for an intellectual historian to do, to look at reception patterns and to see, to develop it wouldn't surprise me, right? But I do think there's research that needs to be done to explore that possibility. So I don't want to say for sure that's the case, but these things might be related.
Okay, Lisa,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope we can meet in person as soon as possible.
Me too. And I hope, vaccinations start getting distributed quickly in Brazil. I really hope everyone stays well and safe. I know it's hard times. So I wish everyone really well. And it's just so fantastic that in these hard times, challenging times, you've still managed to organize these intellectual evenings and connect with each other, but also with people like me. So it's really wonderful, the work you're doing. So I don't know what to say. It's just, I applaud you so much. It takes such perseverance to do that. So, it brings me great joy to see the perseverance in action. So hopefully it brings you joy to do the work as well.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Stay safe. We have to take Nastassja Pugliese again. Thank you very much for this. Where are you?
Thank you, Yara. Thank you for mediating this table and being here with us today. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you both. Thank you, Yara and Nastassja, and everyone behind the scenes running the show.
Yes. E toda a nossa audiência também. Valeu, pessoal.
Muito obrigada, viu, pessoas todas? Cuidem-se. Foi lindo esse terceiro Vozes. Eu preciso dar um aviso. Nós vamos ter uma mesa, a mesa Metodologia e Cânone, que vai acontecer na segunda-feira, dia 31, às 18 horas, com a Ana Rieger e a Ethel Rocha, tá? A data precisou ser alterada. Então, enfim, não acabou e a gente vai se ver de novo em breve.
É isso, pessoal. Obrigada. Até segunda.
Bye, bye. Tchau.